This is Small Talk with Jill, exploring businesses and communities, one virtual interview at a time. Today I'll be speaking with Bob Brzezowski, the Executive Director at the Greater Oneonta Historical Society. The Greater Oneonta Historical Society, a not-for-profit organization, has a membership of more than 400 and a 17-member board of trustees. As one of the largest groups in central New York, the society works to preserve the heritage of the Greater Oneonta area. Welcome, Bob. It's so nice to have you today. The objective is to get information out about our local businesses and organizations here in Otsego County, and also, as we look to the future, educate those people can come and visit and they know a little bit of the behind the scenes. As I was preparing, I kind of had an aha moment. Harlow Bundy was from Oneonta, infamous with IBM, digital media. Here we are capturing this history on a computer. So it kind of is leading back to Oneonta. Can you tell us a little bit more about Harlow?
Harlem moved to Oneonta at an early age and came up with this idea, a system that revolutionized the way that employers could keep track of having individual time cards for every employee. They devised a clock with a mechanism inside where when a person came to work, they'd have a special key. They'd turn the key. It would record the time they came in. They'd turn the key again when they left and record the time they came out. And as you said, it's kind of an early stage in the digital revolution, and an early step 130 years ago. George and Sherman Fairchild helped them to capitalize this innovation. It didn't hurt at all that George Fairchild was a U.S. congressman, so he was able to get something through the House of Representatives that these Bundy time recorders would be placed in post offices throughout the United States. And Oneonta being a railroad town, he had the influence to get it into train depots and railroad companies around the country.
Was it coincidental that Harlow was a postmaster, or was that after the fact?
I think I couldn't have hurt at all. Suspect that George Fairchild's influence played a bigger role than Harlow.
So that turned into what we know as IBM.
Right. The Bundy time recorders were never made in Oneonta. They were made in the Binghamton area, but the four principals were all from Oneonta. It became one of the 3 or 4 companies that formed International Business Machine, of which George Fairchild was the first chairman of the board.
So that's a big name, Fairchild, I think, associated with Oneonta. And another big name, Huntington.
Right, yeah. Collis Huntington and his brother Solon. Actually, Solon came to Oneonta in 1840. He had a store on Main Street. It was part of even though it was a stone building, it was part of what was called Wooden Row. And that came down in a fire in 1908. When gold was discovered in California, Collis Huntington and his brother said, we're not going to move to California, but we're going to open a place in California and provision the miner. They shipped some things out. In 1849, Collis got together a group of 5 other Oneonta men, and they traveled to California together. Great story. There were 3 different ways that people went out to California. One way was around the Cape Horn. One way was across the U.S. before there was any transcontinental railroad, and the third way was to go down to Panama and then make your way across the Isthmus of Panama and get a ship on the other side. Well, getting a ship on the other side in 1849 was no easy task, because there would be ships going into San Francisco, and literally the crew would abandon ship because they wanted to search for gold too. So there wouldn't be any ships coming back again. So they waited for a few months on the other side of the isthmus, wait for a boat to come from Latin America to take them up to San Francisco. They finally got to San Francisco, and most of the 5 men worked with Collis Huntington. None of them, except for kind of playing at it, were ever miners. They worked in Collis's store, but Collis became extremely wealthy. I mean, he was an entrepreneur from the get-go, even in New York, but made enough money to get into the railroad business. He was one of the principals in the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, being completed in 1869, and he was one of the big 4 of the U.S. railroad system. So became extremely wealthy.
Incredible. Actually, I know you recognize this book, and it's hard to come by. I didn't know when I moved here 7 years ago that my ancestors were one of the founding families. And the first time I saw the book, because it's so hard to come by, it was in our Huntington Library in the New York room. When I was up in the New York room, I was also reading typed manuscripts by Huntington of stories.
Well, that was Willard Huntington,
Okay.
the nephew of Collis.
That's incredible.
There's only 2 copies of that. We have a copy at the Historical Society, and Huntington Library has a copy. But you're right, I can't remember how many volumes, but it's 12 or 15 volumes of Willard Huntington's reminiscences and his history of Oneonta from the earliest days.
That is incredible. And also alongside, I have the History of Oneonta by Campbell that I won in an auction fundraiser for the Greater Oneonta Historical Society. But back to Huntington. Now, Niwa Park, there is a railroad car. How does that relate to the railroad, to Huntington? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Doesn't really relate to Huntington at all. The railroad connection of Collis Huntington and Solon's son Henry is just a really interesting coincidence of these titans of the railroad system and the history of the railroad in Oneonta being 2 separate stories that really don't have much of any confluence. The Oneonta story, separate from the Huntingtons, is that in the village of Oneonta was formed in 1848, and 3 men, Eliakim Ford and Jared Goodyear and Harvey Baker, were among the principals in deciding to bring the railroad to Oneonta, bring the railroad to this little village, 300 people or so, because they saw that there was some place between Albany and Binghamton that was going to get development out of having the railroad. So they would regularly take their horse and buggy to Albany and lobby. And in 1865, they were successful, and the railroad came to Oneonta, and it changed Oneonta for the rest of the century and into the 20th century. It made all the difference for Oneonta in its development. Brought the armory here, brought the state normal school, what became SUNY Oneonta, Central New York Fair to Oneonta, lots of things that came with being a city, not to mention a vibrant downtown. And for almost more than 50 years, it was the second biggest fair in New York. And people would come from miles and miles around. There was special trains coming into Oneonta.
So, Bob, can we go back to the history of the railroad? I believe there's 2 other iconic pieces of the history here in Oneonta that has to do with the railroad. Can you tell us a little more?
Well, one is the Red Caboose in Niwa Park, today in Niwa Park. It's a great story. As you know, back in the day, working on the railroad was an extremely dangerous job. If you looked at old Oneonta papers from that period, invariably there'd be articles about men who were either killed or injured in a railroad accident. There started to be brotherhoods formed that were really early, both insurance, providing insurance to families and railroad workers, and also the beginnings of a union for workers. The story is that the brakemen were kind of the most independent lot of the workers. Okay. And so they didn't form a brotherhood until later. So they formed this in 1883, meeting in a little caboose, which was then not used anymore because it was old. And if you know that little caboose, you know that it had a stove inside, for example. Didn't have the same kind of amenities that we might think of as a place where railroad workers could take a break and maybe sleep when they were off shift, etc. That union grew tremendously. Within a year or 2, there were 1 million members nationwide, and they would meet every year in a convention. Oneonta quickly outgrew being able to host such a convention, but every 10 years, every anniversary year, they come to Oneonta. Towards I think it was about 1915 or so, they started talking about how we really consider that caboose a shrine to railroad history and union history, labor history. It's just sitting there in the rail yard. It's deteriorating. We got to do something. So they raised some money. And by the way, it changed from the Brotherhood of Railway Brakemen fairly quickly to the Brotherhood of Railway Trainmen, and became more of a catch-all for any railroad workers who weren't covered by any other of the Brotherhood. They built a spur off the main rail line into Niwa Park and brought it to Niwa Park. In the 1970s, the Smithsonian Institute wanted to bring it to Washington because of its historic importance, and people in Oneonta wanted to keep it, and responded by raising money to put a structure around it to protect it.
So that a piece of history will remain here.
In 2013, we celebrated the 130th anniversary of the founding of the Brotherhood of Railway Brakemen in Niwa Park. We had a representative of the United Transportation Union, which is where the Brotherhood of Railway Brakemen ended up with, National Union, Senator Seward, and lots of other people, including many retired railroad workers. Two of them were Tony Mangillo and his brother Mike. Mike told me he was a child. He knew one of the elderly men in the neighborhood who was one of the founders of the Brotherhood.
Really?
It was just amazing to think that, here 130 years later, there was still somebody with a direct relationship with those founders.
Wow, that gives me chills.
Yeah.
And that's all about storytelling, and that's what you do at the History Center is storytelling. If Mike didn't tell you that story, you wouldn't have that story to share with others. So that's why it's important to preserve history.
And then the other part of Oneonta Railroad District, of course, is the Roundhouse, the world's largest roundhouse. Some debate about, one in Germany too that was about the same size. I think it depends on how you count it, whether you count it being the largest by the largest number of bays where trains could be put, or the square footage. But anyway, it was world's largest, or one of the two largest.
In my shop, I get a lot of tourists, or I've gotten in the past a lot of tourists, and being here only 7 years, I'm talking to a lot of people, or I'll be talking to friends all over the country. And when I mention Oneonta, it feels like everyone's got a story about Oneonta. It's almost like that 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon. Do you think Kevin Bacon has a connection to Oneonta, Bob?
I'm sure we can find one within 6 degrees.
I think we should do a call out to him and ask him if he can find a way to connect himself to Oneonta. I think that would be another fun piece of history to see.
Yeah, we might have to help him a bit on that. But.
We may. And I think you're the expert on that. While researching my own Oneonta family history, I found out I was related to Jimmy Buffett and Amanda Peet. So anything's possible. I know that, fundraising is a big part of what you do to keep the Historical Society going. And I know that you're renovating the third floor.
We're really dependent on fundraising. About a third of our budget, which is pretty modest, about $60,000 a year, comes out of fundraising. Our auction is the biggest part of that, but other events too. Hops for History, pub crawl that we've had for the last several years.
Can you talk about hops? How important hops was to this area?
Yeah, well, it certainly was important to Otsego County. It was #1 county in the country for several years at the end of the 19th century.
Can you tell everybody the plans for the third floor?
We bought this building in 2000. We wanted to be part of Main Street and Main Street's revitalization. It was mostly through the vision of Sally Mullen, the late Sally Mullen, who was the president of the Historical Society before me. She was also the mover and shaker for the Downtown Historic District being formed. She was somebody who was a hard person to say no to, and very much interested in history and interested in downtown's revitalization. So we bought the building and found on the third floor there was a ballroom that hadn't been used since the 1950s. It covers the front 2/3 of that building overlooking Main Street. We know over the years that the Masons, before they moved to the Masonic Lodge, former Fairchild Mansion, used it for meetings. The Knights of Columbus used it in the 30s, 40s, 50s. D&H used to have parties there. Dwight Eisenhower's celebration of Dwight Eisenhower's re-election in 1956 was up there. We think that may have been the last public use of that for the floor. It's the last kind of documented use that we can find for it.
So those walls could talk.
Yeah, 65 years ago since it's been used. We work with Crawford and Stearns Architects, preservation architects out of Syracuse, and have since we bought the building. We're looking forward to really doing as little as possible. That's our true opportunity for restoration. Thanks to Jim Seward, we were awarded $250,000. He and before him, Bill McGee, our former assemblyman, have been very good about getting funding for Otsego County and specifically for the Historical Society.
For those that are watching this, whether they're local or they're out of town and they're watching this, there are virtual tours available?
On the website, get links to gohstours.com.
Well, Bob, I could talk to you all day long. I would love to have another interview, sit-down interview
Great.
with you. Meanwhile, I think we need to see how Kevin Bacon is related to Oneonta.
Okay.
So let's start the charge. Anybody watching this, please, if you know, reach out to him. Help us. Thank you again. Continue.
Thank you.
Well. If you know a business or own a business you'd like to see featured, please comment below. If you are new, consider subscribing to this channel and sharing it with other people who would enjoy its content. Until next time, remember, here on Small Talk, we are connecting people to people and business to business.